Pointing to an events database. Let's begin. The connection server is going to log its events in a database, but the trick is we need to tell the connection server where that events database is. Now, fortunately, on this domain controller, I just installed SQL Server 2014. And as part of that install on this domain controller, I accepted most of the defaults. And then I created an additional database as part of that SQL Server instance, and I called that database View Events DB. Now, in this lab environment that I happen to be in, I'm using the domain admin account a lot. And in a production environment, you would not want to use that same domain admin account for virtually everything. You'd want to have separate users and separate groups with specific rights to do the jobs they need to do. And the reason specifically that in this course and in these nuggets I'm using the domain admin account is that I want to remove as much as possible some of these stumbling blocks that you might come across if you're implementing this in a lab environment. So with this View Events database existing on this Windows domain controller called AD-RDS at .111, and what we'll do is we'll log into View Administrator and we'll configure View to use that database to capture and record the View events. So here in View Administrator, if we go under Monitoring and go down to Events, it's going to say, you don't have any events database configured. You don't have any events to view. So to configure the database that this connection server can use for the events database, we're going to select View Configuration, and then from the bottom here, select Event Configuration. And under Event Databases, it indicates we have no database currently defined. We'll go ahead and define one by clicking on Edit. Now currently, I've got a SQL server that's running on the domain controller on the host called AD-RDS. So we'll put in the name of the host that's running the SQL server, and I've already verified that this computer, CS-1, can correctly resolve that to the appropriate IP address of .111. Then it's asking for our database type, SQL Server or Oracle. I happen to have a SQL Server 2014 server running over there on the domain controller. The default port for SQL Server is 1433. We'll leave that as is. Next, it's asking for the database name that we want to connect to. And that already has to be set up in SQL Server. So let's make a road trip over to that domain controller and take a look at the SQL Server running there. So now we're looking at the domain controller, the AD-RDS host. And let's go ahead and launch Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. And here we have a database called View Events Database. And I've also got a user called DBuser that has been set up that is the owner and has full access to that database. Another item worth mentioning is that we want to make sure that this computer that's running the SQL Server, that its Windows firewall is allowing that inbound connection for SQL Server. The database name that exists over on that SQL Server is named View Events DB. And the user account that has access to that database is db-user. So we will put in and confirm the password for that db-user account. And then for the table prefix, let's use VE underscore as a way to organize our tables in the database. And we'll click on OK. So now here in the event database section, it shows us that we're using a SQL server. That's the location of that SQL server. We're using port 1433. The database name is View Events DB. The user we're using is db-user, and our prefix is VE underscore. So now, if we go under Monitoring and Events, this is being retrieved from our events database. So this is the one that we just did together, and the one that was just a little bit before that is me testing it to make sure it was going to work successfully. And the piece that hung me up for a moment was the Windows firewall running on the SQL server that was not initially allowing the inbound connections for those database requests. And on VMware's website, they've got some great documentation regarding VMware Horizon View, including some of the details regarding preparing the SQL Server database for event reporting. Now, what I would recommend that you do, if you have access to a Microsoft or a SQL Server expert in your enterprise or in your group, I would reach out and ask that person for some assistance in setting up the SQL Server side of it. And that's exactly what I did here at CBT Nuggets. I reached out to Garth. He's an expert on SQL Server. And by spending some time with him on the SQL Server side, that allowed me to focus on the Horizon View side and connecting to the existing SQL database that he walked me through creating. And if you're interested in more training on SQL Server, I would strongly recommend Garth's courses right here at CBT Nuggets. In this nugget, we've connected to the connection server. We launched the View Administrator. We went to Event Configuration, and we configured View to use an existing SQL Server database for the capture and recording of View events. I appreciate you spending the time with me in this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.